All right. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm going to talk about Avalanche release. And a lot of you have already heard me give this talk or some flavor of it, but as Simon told me at the National Avalanche School, he said it actually seems like it might be getting better, which is always a good thing. I'm always looking for improvement. So this is basically part of chapter 9, very briefly touching on parts of chapter 10, and then diving in a little deeper on chapter 11. So dry slab avalanche release. And, you know, the the um, the thing about avalanches is, how can a single person on a snowmobile put tens of thousands of tons of snow in motion? And the way that happens is that avalanches are a cascading process. And that means that if we input just a small amount of energy, that can lead to a cascade resulting in an enormous avalanche like this. Essentially, a small perturbation can get the process going. And my goal by the end of this lecture is that you'll be able to explain this process. Here comes the snowmobiler blasting out of the backside of that avalanche. And if you want to look at that video again and again, you can see it in the book. So, we're going to start out with just a little background. First thing is what drives the cascading process of avalanche release. Second is a few key components of slab avalanches, and then a brief discussion of slope scale spatial variability before we actually talk about the release process. So let's start with what drives the cascading process of avalanche release. And in order to have a cascading process, we need to have some sources of stored potential energy. And in the snowpack, we have two of those sources. One is our porous weak layer. So the slab can move downward and into that porous weak layer and bend as it does so. And the second source of potential energy is just the position of the slab on the hillside before it slides down. So the slab has two sources of potential energy. The fact that it's up above the bed surface because of the weak layer, and also because it's on a hillside and can slab down or can slide down. Second thing, what are a few key components of slab avalanches? And you all know these things very well, and I'm just going to skim over them. We need a slab. And what do we mean by a slab? It's the layer over the weak layer. And these slabs need to be both soft and flexible, soft so they can bend, and strong enough to actually support propagation. Weak layers, Weak layers are simply collapsible layers in the snowpack. They can be persistent weak layers like surface hoar in this picture or facets, or they can be non-persistent weak layers as well. Cracks and critical crack lengths. A crack is simply a break in the snow, and a critical crack is the length at which the crack then begins to propagate on its own. And we can see these in propagation saw tests, right? You cut the weak layer, and at some point that crack becomes critical. And when it becomes critical, it propagates on its own. Now, um, the length of that crack is not the same as the critical crack length in an avalanche, and we can discuss the details of that if people want to, but it does give us an index for that, sort of a relative measure. And there's these variations in critical crack length that help us understand instability. Essentially, if we have short critical crack lengths, it's unstable. Longer critical crack lengths are more stable. And these critical crack lengths depend on the slab stiffness, the weak layer strength, and the load. Okay. And again, these things are all covered in detail in chapter 10. And of course, it also changes over time. So just quickly, an example of crack propagation. This is collapse mode crack propagation. Propagation is simply the spontaneous expansion of a crack. or a crack growing without any input of outside energy. So the most important mode for triggering avalanches is this collapse mode for human triggered avalanche. And you'll hear scientists call it anti-cracking, but essentially what crack mode or what collapse mode crack propagation is, we bend the slab, we break the weak layer over a critical length, and then the crack is driven by the collapsing and bending slab. So this is just an example. You see the slab bending. As the slab bends, the weak layer collapses behind it, and that bending slab creates this wave away from that initial trigger point. And that's collapse mode crack propagation. And then a final component of slab avalanches has to do with the terrain. And the question we're asking ourselves here is the slope steep enough to slide? That slab needs to overcome friction, so we're mostly talking about slope angles between around 30 to 45 degrees. But as we saw with Brian's presentation earlier, sometimes it can be on slightly gentler terrain. It can also be on somewhat steeper terrain as well. Okay, so we've gone through what drives the cascading process and the key components. Just very briefly, a discussion of slope scale spatial variability. In chapter 9, we talk about these different spatial scales of variability, whether it's a continental scale or a regional scale, which is where our forecast centers operate typically, or the slope scale. And understanding slope scale variability is critically important for understanding avalanche release. And the main thing that we're interested in with slope scale spatial variability is where are the potential trigger locations? Now, what we'll see when we look at spatial variability is that it's highly complex and that variability depends on the slope, the weak layer, how the slab interacts with the weak layer, and all this changes over time. And this emphasizes the uncertainty associated with triggering locations and explosive placements. And we'll look at how this comes into play here in the next part of this talk. So, that's all the appetizer. Now let's get to the main course and talk about slab avalanche release. So I'm just going to talk mainly about our current understanding of slab avalanche release, and we're going to talk about these 5 stages of dry slab avalanches. We'll also discuss a little bit about implications for avalanche professionals and other triggers. And we're going to focus on human triggers. So at the end, we'll cover some of these other triggers for dry slab avalanches. Again, with the stages of dry slab avalanche release, we have 5 stages, and we're going to first briefly go over them, and then we'll discuss each of these in detail. And to do that, we're going to use a series of diagrams that Simon and I worked on together with a graphic artist, and I'm pretty psyched about them. But these, we start out with an undisturbed snowpack, and then let's say we put a skier or a snowboarder or a snowmobiler on it, and that person bends the slab and then breaks the weak layer over a critical length. Now, that critical length can be up to maybe around a meter is what we think. We don't know for sure, but that's about what we think is around a meter or less, sometimes much less. So if you reach that critical crack length, then we get this first stage of crack propagation. And that initial crack propagation phase happens in collapse mode. So that crack propagates outward for that first 2 to 5, maybe 8 meters in collapse mode, even on a very steep slope. It's still happening in this collapse mode. And then as that bit of snow begins to move downhill, that increases the shear stress along the weak layer, and the movement of the slab then drives what we call super shear. So very, very rapid crack propagation in both directions, upslope and downslope in shear. The fourth stage is breaking the slab boundaries. As that slab continues to move down slope, there's enough energy to break the remaining slab boundaries. And finally, the avalanche releases as long as the slope is steep enough for the slab to overcome friction along the bed surface. And so again, this video is included in the book, so you get to watch it as many times as you like. All right. So the first stage of a human-triggered avalanche, skier or snowmobiler bends a slab, breaks the weak layer over a length longer than the critical crack length. And how easy to do this depends in part on how deep the weak layer is buried. The amount of stress placed on the weak layer depends on how thick and how stiff the slab is. And in particular, the stress decreases dramatically with increasing depth, as we see in this diagram. Note that people rarely trigger an avalanche at a point where the slab exceeds a meter, especially if that slab is hard, but we can certainly trigger bigger, much bigger slides from thinner parts of the slab. And I like this little diagram, this animation made by Bruce Jameson. The red bulb or the red sort of balloon under the skier is the stress that the skier is exerting that is sufficient to crack the weak layer over a critical length. And what you'll see is an example of thin spot triggering. So the skier skis down, doesn't trigger any avalanche here, but when that bulb intersects the weak layer, creates a critical crack, crack goes up slope, and down goes the snow. So this just gives a very basic idea of this concept of spatial variability, where person after person after person can go down a slope, but then the next person might trigger it because they might be in a thinner part of the slab or maybe a weaker part of the weak layer. And so, this picture here might look like an early stage of avalanche release, but we've actually gone through all the stages except for the snow sliding downhill. But what's interesting here is that, this is the fourth person down the slope. And where is the trigger point? Obviously, it wasn't anywhere along the first three people's tracks. But if we look at this avalanche and look at these same 2 points, where this person skied over right after the avalanche slides, we see right here a rock and right here a rock. So as you go from these people's tracks over to Looker's right, we have rocks exposed. We have a series of rocks in here. And so we had a thinner area of the slab, and that was enough for that person to get the crack, bend the slab enough, break a critical crack or a crack that's a critical size, and get that initial crack propagation phase to begin. So the second stage, that first stage is creating a critical crack. The second stage is the stage of initial crack propagation. So once the person creates a critical crack, then this initial crack propagation phase begins, and this occurs in collapse mode. Now, for years, all us old people were taught that this happened in shear. And and so if you talk to some old patroller or somebody on the skin track, or even someone that just hasn't followed this stuff over the last 10 or 15 years, and they're probably going to tell you that these initial cracks occur in shear, but all the data suggests that they don't. Um, and when we first started learning about this or thinking about this more carefully was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Bruce Jameson and his graduate student, Crane Johnson, measured the crack speed of a WUMF. And the measured speed was much slower than that predicted by the shear model. And then they proposed that collapse was driving propagation. And those findings met with plenty of blowback from some other scientists, but this wasn't a new idea. It had been noted by practitioners since the early part of the 20th century, And it was more formally proposed by Charlie Bradley, who founded the Earth Sciences Department at Montana State University and who proposed these ideas of collapsing propagation in the 1960s. And despite the blowback over the next 25 years, their findings were overwhelmingly confirmed with fieldwork with propagation saw tests and extended column tests and particle tracking on slopes and in the flats, persistent and non-persistent weak layers, and all backed up with numerical models as well. Here's an example of very high speed, 3,000 frames per second, a very small propagation saw test. You can see the saw going in here and zoom, getting that collapse mode propagation. And the Swiss were doing some very large ones as well. I'm not going to show you that one. There were also more measurements of WUMFs, but there was one outlier in the data, and Dave Hamry, Ron Simonhuis, and I collaborated on a project to measure crack speeds from videos. We analyzed several Avalanche release videos, and we documented extremely fast crack speeds. And this project happened after Dave cornered me at one ISSW and said, "Boy, I think all these crack speeds you guys are measuring are way too slow. I've seen them, and they're much faster than that." And I said, "Well, then we just need some data." And we started brainstorming, and Ron was actually working on a similar project at the same time. So we all collaborated and did an ISSW paper. And what we found was some of these crack speeds were faster than collapse mode cracks and even much faster than the prediction of shear crack speeds. So what was going on? Everyone was wondering. And interestingly, at the same time, some of the numerical modelers noticed something unusual when they expanded their models to larger slopes. So the models were also showing jumps in crack speed. So cracks were accelerating slowly at first and then accelerating much faster later. Whoops. Well, there's just one output from one of the numerical models. And this is kind of an interesting one that you may not have seen before. So this is a slope angle of 0. So this is flat on the upper one. On the lower one, the slope angle is 30 degrees. And these are modeled propagation saw tests that are 30 meters long. Okay, so 0 over here, 30 meters long. And we're going to watch the slab over the weak layer and watch how much faster this slab at 30 degrees accelerates as it goes into super shear. Zoom, that one accelerates, and then we have this slow, consistent crack due to collapse mode. All right, so at the slope scale, the initial crack is in collapse mode. So that snowmobile or that snowboarder bent the slab and broke an area just around them where it was propagating outward in collapse mode. But as that piece of snow began moving downhill, it transitions to super shear, goes much faster around the slope, and you get much faster crack speeds. The crack speed for is about 4 to 5 times faster in super shear than it is in collapse. So again, back to this diagram, it's the slab moving downhill that drives this cracking, and we get these much faster crack speeds. And if you want to know why this shear cracking is so much faster than the collapse mode, think of a rope. So if we pull a rope between me and one of you, and I wave the rope up and down, that's like a collapse mode crack. That's a wave that travels along. If I pull on that, that's more like a shear crack. So, and you note that if I put a wave in that, it takes a long time for that to get to you. If I pull on it, it's almost instantaneous. So it's a different kind of wave. All right. Um, Ron Simonhoy's developed some video magnification techniques, and he showed us in some of these videos how some of these cracks propagated. So here's a skier, and all these red zones that are opening up here, that is showing areas where that crack has already propagated. So we've got very, very fast crack speeds, and Ron was a co-author on a really important paper discussing a lot of this super shear stuff. So good stuff. Well, with that slab moving downhill, there's plenty of available energy to crack the rest of the slab boundaries, the crown, the flanks, and the stock wall, and then the avalanche releases. So our fourth stage is breaking the slab boundaries. And then our fifth stage is avalanche release as long as the slope is steep enough to slide. So again, back to our little animation, the skier bends the slab. Skier bends the slab, breaks the weak layer. We get initial crack propagation, then we get super shear. Slab moves downhill, and we have the energy to break it and to slide downhill. All right, so a few implications for avalanche professionals. With a collapse mode crack propagation, the weak layer and the slab are both critically important. It's that bending slab that drives the crack propagation, so the fracture may arrest due to a compromised or weakened slab. Again, the slab is critically important. So if we want to test stability, we need to bend the slab to test the snow. And this is why an extended column test, a propagation saw test, and even a roosh block are the best tests we have, but they're still too small to really capture all the processes. So they're not perfect, but they're better than something like a shovel shear, which is measuring the wrong thing, or a compression test where you're not really bending that slab. Of course, the best is probably a well-placed explosive. And to trigger avalanches, we really want to try and maintain slab integrity. So this is one reason why air blasts work quite well for avalanche mitigation. We actually maintain that slab integrity better instead of breaking the slab all apart. Again, the slab's critically important. So that means if we want to stabilize slopes with ski compaction, we need to thoroughly disrupt the slab and the weak layer on the order of every 2 to 5 meters. So when people talk about backcountry slopes being ski compacted, it really all depends on the snowpack, right? Like if we have a situation where, say, if that thing is down to bumps and you're skiing through the slab and on the weak layer, then yes, we can provide some stabilization. But you need to have a slope that is skied very, very thoroughly to have skier compaction, and that skiing has to take place through the slab and into the weak layer. Some other practical implications is as the slab begins to move downhill, that super shear begins, and slab disruptions may not arrest propagation as effectively. So, for ski areas, for example, in order to prevent avalanches from releasing, we need to arrest cracks before they transition to super shear. So that means that we really need to beat the heck out of those slopes. This means that a that begins in a relatively undisturbed part of a slope may be more likely to take out previous tracks or explosive craters. And so, we cover a little bit of this in the post-mitigation release chapter. I think that's chapter 17 in the book too. All right, a little more. Another practical implication of super shear is when we're doing mitigation work, if we can crack enough of the weak layer, in other words, if we can break it over that super shear distance, then we can send the system straight into super shear without that initial crack propagation phase. And that increases the likelihood of triggering larger avalanches and releasing more snow. And that might be another good explanation for air blast effectiveness. All right. Just going to quickly break through some other triggers. I'm not going to go through this in any great detail. The main thing is now that we understand avalanche release, um, we understand that we need to bend the slab and break the weak layer. Once we do that, everything else happens, right? So how do cornices trigger avalanches? Well, we bend the slab, break the weak layer. Okay. And this is the same thing too with other triggers. Say we get new snow, windblown snow. Remember that the slab is not going to be as uniform as this. There's going to be areas of the slab that are weaker, areas of the slab that are stronger. Deposition is going to be more extreme in certain areas than in other areas. And we just need enough of that snow to add up in one area to start bending that slab and breaking the weak layer underneath. And explosives, I'm not really going to go into. If you're tossing explosives, it's better to have them on the surface and even better to put them in the air. It helps. You actually reach more of the snowpack and you keep that slab a little bit more, you keep that slab integrity a little bit better. And finally, how about wet slabs? Water flows into the snowpack typically along flow channels and then travels down slope along capillary barriers, which is often the interface between the slab and the weak layer. The slab is going to become less stiff as it becomes warmer, so it's going to be able to bend more easily. That shortens the critical crack length. And the weak layer, that interface is going to become weaker. That also shortens the critical crack length. And at some point, if we bend that slab into an area where the weak layer is weaker, again, we're bending the slab, we're breaking the weak layer, and that avalanche release process begins. And just to close out, instead of focusing on shear for 40 years, maybe we should have been listening to this guy, Charlie Bradley. And here's a diagram from a paper that Charlie wrote in 1966. And the interesting thing is that right along the bed surface where the propagation is occurring, he's saying that it's happening in compression and in shear. And so he had some ideas about the way avalanches is released. Other people had very good reasons for why they thought shear was the dominant mechanism. But it's just kind of neat to go back to some of this old literature and see that, there was this push and pull back in the 1960s before most scientists fell on the side of that initial crack propagation being in shear. But it's neat to go back and look at some of Charlie's old stuff. And just a couple of words about the starting zone, and then we're going to be done. Um, I just want to say, this is the QR code for the book. Um, if people ask you for your passwords, I would encourage those people who are interested to buy the book. Tried to keep it affordable, so hopefully people can afford it. We're if you want to use materials from the book in your class, a class you're teaching, please keep that to a minimum. I mean, you under copyright law, as long as it's nonprofit, you can use materials that are copywritten in your classes. Um, if you want to use extensively from the book, the exception, I guess the exception is for extensive use of the book. Um, if if the course you are teaching requires the book as a text, like in a university, or if you're talking to a ski patrol that has purchased a copy for all their patrollers or something like that, then you're more than welcome to borrow from the book for that training. So, any questions? Just feel free to drop me an email, or if someone asks you who's teaching Avalanche classes about that, just give them my email. and have them reach out to me. And that's that.